The Wild West town of Deadwood, like many others scattered across the twilight-soaked prairies of 19th century America, had a certain reputation. Imagine a dusty boardwalk, a creaking saloon sign, and the clinking of whiskey glasses under gas lamps that flickered like sleepy fireflies. The streets echoed with the echoes of boots, spurs, and trouble reheated. But peel back the curtain after midnight, and you'd find the real action wasn't in the poker rooms or the jailhouse. It was behind velvet drapes and parlor doors, inside the bordellos, where the night didn't end so much as it gently folded over itself, like warm laundry. It's important to banish a few cinematic expectations early on. Brothels of the Old West were rarely the fever dream Vegas saloons of Hollywood. No glossy lipstick or endless feathers. Feathers were expensive. Many brothels smelled more like boiled cabbage and pipe smoke than perfume and scandal. And very few people looked like cowboys from a cologne commercial. You know the type. Chiseled jaw, perfect stubble, not a bead of sweat despite riding 14 hours through arid scrubland. Please. By the time most cowhands got to town, they looked and smelled like soup made from desperation and leather. Now, after midnight, when the lawmen dozed, the gamblers lost their last nickel, and the piano man nodded off mid-chord. The brothels quietly pivoted from performance to peculiar domesticity. You might be expecting wild orgies and debauchery on chaise lounges, but often it was foot soaks, card games, long talks, the occasional hair-brushing circle, a bit like a teenage sleepover, but with more bourbon and fewer pillow fights. Madams, the women who ran these establishments, were more CEOs than seductresses. Think of them as the Victorian-era Airbnb superhosts with a side of real estate strategy. They managed rosters, bought supplies, balanced the books, and often knew more about territorial politics than the local mayor. A successful madam wielded power in silence, like a cat with a ledger. And once the doors closed for the night, they did what all good administrators do. They counted the day's take, brewed strong coffee, and re-sewed torn corsets while speculating about the governor's latest affair. Let's slink quietly now into one such house, Kate Big Nose Elder's boarding house, where scandal met starch. Now, despite her unfortunate nickname, Kate did not, in fact, have a particularly large nose. The moniker was likely bestowed by someone with fewer teeth than kindness. She was clever, literate, and had the extraordinary ability to read men like newspapers. Her brothel was not the rowdiest in town, but certainly the coziest. Each girl who worked for Kate had her own room, modest but well kept, with lace curtains and washstands bearing chipped porcelain basins. After midnight, the sounds of boot stomping and forced laughter gave way to the brush of slippers on wood. Bathwater warmed over the stove, tea steeped in mismatched mugs, and someone, always someone, would hum a tune so tender it hurt. One girl, Eleanor, wrote sonnets in the lull between customers. Not very good ones, mind you, but heartfelt. Another, Maybelle, kept pigeons and once taught one to retrieve poker chips like a feathery side hustle. The brothel's piano, out of tune but romantic, got occasional use as a drying rack for stockings. Most men who arrived after midnight weren't there for carnal escapades, but for conversation, comfort, and the illusion of companionship. Lonely gold miners, homesick railroad workers, one emotionally pent-up banker who once paid just to sit and braid a woman's hair while confessing his financial fears. There's humanity in that. Sleepy, odd, slightly sweaty humanity. Amid flickering kerosene lamps, the madam would lock up the downstairs doors while someone folded linens upstairs, quiet rhythms of a house unwinding. The girls removed makeup with cold cream, relaced their corsets into something resembling freedom, and occasionally debated politics in their chemises while slicing apples with small penknives. In truth, these brothels were rare sanctuaries in rough towns, offering tenderness among gunslingers, a splash of rosewater between dust storms. The secrets they held weren't scandalous. They were strangely domestic. An entire secret society united by footbaths and whispered lullabies. And so, in the deep hush between midnight and sunrise, when the rest of the frontier was passed out or passed over, the women of the brothels lived an entirely different story. One stitched together by soft laughs, candle smoke, and a valiant attempt to make weak coffee taste strong. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into Dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now hush. We'll slip further into this world soon enough. For now, let midnight settle like dust on whiskey glass. Ah, yes. The grand saloon doors have swung shut behind us. The poker chips are stacked. And somewhere in the back corner, a badly tuned piano wheezes out, "Oh, Susanna," for the 9th time in a row. This is not merely a western town. It's a dusty fever dream of whiskey, woolen corsets, and questions your high school history teacher probably skipped over with alarming haste. Tonight, our boots tread softly through the world of midnight in a brothel, where the air is thick with rose oil, lamp smoke, and the awkward tension of second-hand poetry. We find ourselves in one of the less examined chambers of Wild West history, the moment after the cowboys stopped shouting and the candles started flickering low. Now, first things first. Brothel in the Wild West wasn't necessarily the steamy Babylon you've seen on late-night cable reruns. Sure, there were corsets and crimson-coloured drapes, but many of these establishments functioned more like communal living spaces with a side hustle. They were part boarding house, part performance venue, part social salon. And yes, there was also some horizontal athletics, but that's only one thread in this velvety quilt. After midnight, the house would quiet down. The louder guests, usually miners with whiskey breath and gold dust in their ears, had either passed out or been gently encouraged to leave via the universal 19th century signal for parties over, which involved extinguishing a communal lamp. The ladies, whom society primly referred to as soiled doves, a poetic insult if there ever was one, would shed their elaborate daywear. Think 6 pounds of petticoats, bustle padding, and an unnecessarily itchy chemise, and trade it for night robes stitched from soft cotton, perhaps sent from an aunt back in Missouri who thought they were working in haberdashery. In those moonlit hours, these women did what women the world over do when given a moment's peace. They took off their shoes and gossiped cruelly about men. Picture it. Candles flickering low on wooden vanities, hair unpinned and cascading in unplanned directions, someone nibbling a sugared lemon rind, while another reads from a crumpled penny dreadful that features, ironically, a heroic cowboy who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the actual West. These were rarely idle women. Brothel life after business slowed down was its own ecosystem. Some women mended gowns torn during overly enthusiastic twirls. Others updated ledgers, a task the madam took extremely seriously. You see, a well-run brothel was more tightly managed than a federal post office. Each service rendered, yes, that kind of service, but also laundry or sewing buttonholes, was recorded in careful handwriting. Math was involved. There were receipts. A misplaced decimal could result in a very unsexy financial loss. Madams often former doves themselves, walked a line between maternal guidance and iron-fisted accountancy. One might find her at her desk after hours, spectacles perched low, tallying sales over the sounds of creaking floors and distant melancholy banjo strings. If a girl had a talent, flair for painting perhaps, or a passable imitation of Annie Oakley's trick-shot routine, it was sometimes monetized during in-house ladies' exhibitions that mostly existed to convince shy ranch boys to stay another night. It's worth noting that these ladies weren't always looking for escape. Some had chosen this life after far rougher ones. If you'd spent your 20s trying to grow corn in Arizona with a man named Zebediah and half a mule named Clementine, brothel life with hot food and evening companionship might seem downright luxurious. And the tales they told. After midnight, stories tumbled out in whispers, some real, some invented. One girl claimed she'd once been mistaken for General Custer's niece and had danced a waltz with a Union officer in New York. Another described a ghost who limped through the parlor at 3 a.m., muttering something about stolen boots. Whether true or spun from boredom, these tales stitched a kind of myth into their nights, thick as the patchwork quilts layered on their narrow beds. Then, slowly, the house would settle. The last of the talking tapered into faint yawns. A runaway kitten named Clara curled up beside someone's toes. The piano key fell silent. Somewhere outside, a lone coyote howled, not in menace, but in melodramatic solidarity. And in those gentle, final moments, just before dreams arrived bearing vague images of riverboats and silk parasols, they would fall asleep knowing the sun would rise again. Alongside the hangovers and misplaced hats and all the usual frontier oddities. But before that rooster crows and the stovetop coffee over cooks, let's take another quiet step forward into the lives of those who ran the show from behind the curtain. The clever madams with ledgers full of secrets and a taste for power that no corset could contain. By the quiet glow of oil lamps and the occasional crackle of a stove fire, Wild West brothels transformed after sundown into little theatres of velvet and secrets, their true symphony beginning sometime after midnight when the saloons emptied and the tin stars of local sheriffs went to bed. Outside, coyotes howled their lonesome lullabies beneath the slip of silver moon. But inside, inside was a different matter altogether. Despite the popular myth, the women of the night weren't perpetually draped upon pianos or forever sashing through clouds of cigar smoke in crimson corsets. No, by midnight, the novelty had worn thin. The piano had gone silent, the whiskey was mostly gone, and even the most enthusiastic cowboys were beginning to wobble like overcooked flapjacks. That's when the real work, and oddly enough, the real rest began. After the final bell of business, many brothels shifted from public display to a kind of backstage domesticity. Picture a row of exhausted women in mismatched flannel robes, removing makeup in tin mirrors while gossiping in a curious blend of local slang and borrowed French. Somewhere in the background, someone was boiling water for tea. Yes, tea. Because even in the Wild West, with all its shootouts and saloon brawls, some battles were best fought with chamomile and a shortbread biscuit. You see, these brothels weren't simply dens of debauchery. They were micro-universes of adaptability. In fact, many of the more successful madams, a title that carried as much business acumen as it did societal stigma, enforced surprisingly strict house rules. Bathing was required. Regular doctor visits were scheduled. And bedtime, strange as it may sound, was an enforced concept, albeit a flexible one. After hours, when noise had dwindled to murmurs and shadows moved slower on the walls, the brothel became something else entirely. A boarding house, a makeshift family home, and once in a while, a kind of salon. Picture this: a half-dozen women lounging barefoot around a cast-iron stove, comparing notes on their clients, not to mock, but to warn. Their memories were sharp. "Beware, Mr. Winslow," one might mumble while braiding her hair. "He pays in gold but has wandering hands and terrible breath." They were informal spreadsheets of survival, organized by lipstick smudges instead of columns. There was also the curious bedtime economy that emerged. Missing buttons. Lucinda could sew them back on, 2 cents each. Sore feet. Daisy knew how to make a poultice from goose fat and sassafras. Wanted a love letter ghost-written to a sweetheart imagined back east. Well, that was Clara's specialty. She had a romantic flair and decent enough penmanship, if you didn't mind a few exaggerated adjectives. And yes, there were pets. One brothel in Dodge City owned a 3-legged cat named Whiskey Biscuit, who reportedly slept on top of the madam's cash box. In Virginia City, a particularly well-decorated establishment kept canaries in tiny gold cages to cheer the girls during long, dusty afternoons. After midnight, those canaries sang lullabies, off-key perhaps, but oddly soothing. Perhaps most dreamlike of all were the stargazing hours. Yes, stargazing, because some rooftops made better retreats than beds. Cloaked in cotton shawls, the women would sneak up beneath the endless frontier sky just to sit in quiet awe. The stars above Deadwood or Tucson looked especially reckless, wilder than any outlaw and far brighter than anyone's future had seemed at 15. "You know," one woman might sigh, "I bet there's a galaxy out there where men make the tea." And always, somewhere in the background, loomed the ledger book, the eternal grim accountant of every transaction, every favor traded, every cent earned or mislaid. It was guarded by the madam like a dragon guarding treasure, though in truth it read less like an epic tale and more like a grocery list with scandalous footnotes. So no, not every night was fireworks and fan dances. More often, it was heated bricks at the foot of a bed, soft snoring mingled with racial lullabies from immigrant girls who missed home, and idle dreams sketched between candle stubs. When the world outside was dust, dispute, and disorder, these twilight moments offered a dreamy kind of order, strange, secret, and soft. And just as night began to pull its blanket tighter over the desert hills, when the smouldering lamps finally sputtered out and a hush settled deep into the wooden floorboards, you could almost swear the brothel began to exhale too. Stillness descended, not as a visitor, but as a house guest invited to stay till dawn. And in that velvet silence behind closed doors and papered walls, the whispers of dreams twined gently with the distant rhythm of hoofbeats fading down the road. As the last gold rush flickered out and prairie dogs resumed their quiet dominion over the plains, the brothels of the Wild West remained like warm hearths on a cold frontier, glowing, humming, and perfect for whispering away the hours between dusk and dawn. While outside, coyotes yawned and saloon doors creaked slightly in the wind. Inside, the night took on a quieter, more peculiar rhythm. It's a common misconception that the brothel was always a place of raucous howling and unchaste abandon. In truth, once the bravado of cow-punched heroes and whiskey-slosh prospectors faded into slumber, or at least into a snoring slump on a velvet chaise, the midnight hours often turned downright domestic. You see, many of the working women of these establishments were also night philosophers, amateur chefs, impromptu tailors, and accidental veterinarians. There was a lot of waiting in the profession, and plenty of opportunity for, let's call it, career diversification. In the hush of those late hours, the parlour might be lit only by the flicker of a sooty oil lamp and the occasional ember from someone's over-ambitious applewood fire. Upstairs, Madame Rosalie could often be found donning her bifocals, mending a torn corset with the surgical precision of a Civil War field nurse. She had once been a seamstress in Baltimore, or so she claimed. Frankly, no one could verify this, as all the letters she'd ever received had mysteriously been addressed from places that mysteriously didn't exist. Downstairs, Lacey May, who had a remarkable talent for taming stray dogs and rowdy patrons, might be found kneeling beside the latest fur-covered arrival, smearing it lovingly with a salve somehow always made of bear fat, sassafras, and something she called opossum hope. And oh, if the girls weren't working, there was always cooking to be done. Midnight chili that somehow contained no identifiable meat, flapjacks fried in old whiskey, biscuit attempts that doubled as doorstops. It wasn't five-star dining, it wasn't even one-star dining. But it was warm, and it smelled of molasses and comfort. Many of the girls shared a preference for storytelling over slumber. Not the kind you'd expect, no tales of broken hearts or wagon trains under siege, but quieter stories. How Nettie once disguised herself as a piano tuner to escape a stalker from Cheyenne, or how Dottie had accidentally taught herself Morse code by eavesdropping through the floorboards on the telegraph office next door. For a time, Dottie could recite US military transmissions in her sleep, though this rarely made her popular during bath time. Even more surprising were the books. Yes, books. In one brothel in Deadwood, a shelf full of battered tomes lined the hallway. Poetry by Byron, essays by Locke, cookbooks meant for Boston kitchens, and even a tattered ballroom dance manual that never quite explained what to do with your hands. Reading circles took place around 2 a.m., when the last client had nodded off in a pile of velvet rope or wandered into the birdcage thinking it was the privy. One night, they tried reading Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream out loud. Everyone agreed it made more sense when you were tired, tipsy, and wearing nothing but stockings and sarcasm. There was also music. A few women played piano, harmonica, or fiddle, though the fiddle was only allowed during odd-numbered hours after Miss Clara accidentally set her fake eyelashes aflame with rosin dust. Some of the old-timers swore you hadn't lived until you'd heard Sweet Betsy from Pike played on an out-of-tune harpsichord, while someone danced in a bedsheet toga made from curtains. All of this, every cup of midnight tea served in chipped mugs, every whispered anecdote, every sock patched with dental floss, was part of a quiet ritual. These were the strange secret hours when the performance stopped, and the people underneath the petticoats peeked out. They might be exhausted. They might be sore from corsets, sore from conversation, sore from listening to yet another man explain how he nearly made his fortune panning for dust in an arroyo. But in these hours, they didn't have to pretend. It was their time. Strange, sleepy, sisterly. A slice of calm that history rarely respects, let alone addresses. And if you listened carefully, past the rhythmic snoring of an out-cold cattleman, you might even hear someone softly humming. Not a bawdy song, but a lullaby. One from home, wherever that was. Because even in the rough and ragged lands of the West, after midnight was a time when the wild dared to be quiet. And as the candlelight thinned into gold and the coals slouched into ash, another sort of drama was beginning to stir just beyond the brothel walls. One involving politics, paperwork, and a surprising number of petticoats. The saloon lamps flickered behind ruffled curtains, casting golden shadows against the wallpaper, like they were all part of an overdone play. Outside, the town muttered itself to sleep. Horses snorted softly in their stables, boots clonked lazily across boardwalks, and somewhere far off, a dog gave a half-hearted bark before thinking better of it. Inside the brothel, though, a different kind of hush was setting in. Midnight had come and gone, taking with it the rowdy piano music and the rattle of whiskey glasses. What was left were the quieter rituals of the girls who painted on mystery by gaslight and wiped it off under moonlight. You'd be forgiven for thinking the brothel's life ended when the last client shuffled out, smelling of pipe smoke and perfume half spent. But no, after midnight, the real work began. Pearl, whose corset had seen at least 3 presidential elections, sank into the velvet divan and yawned like a lioness who'd just finished a 4-hour monologue. She reached for her jar of Pond's cold cream as if it were a holy relic. "You know," she said, dabbing at her cheeks, "this town's got more dust than dignity, and I still get asked if my lashes are real." Over in the corner, Minnie was tallying her take for the evening in a notebook that also contained several sketches of particularly rude customers. Minnie was a savant with numbers and anatomical caricatures, frequently drawing both with equal scorn. "I had a fella tonight try to pay me with Confederate dollars," she said dryly. "Told him I'd accept him if he'd also give me a time machine." The brothel wasn't just a place of business. It was part post office, part consulate, part therapy office, and part impromptu theatre troupe. Every woman here had 2 or 3 names, depending on who was asking, and a foot in about 5 different stories at once. One of them claimed to have danced for President Grant, probably false. Another had a tattoo in Mandarin she said meant eternity, definitely meant duck, and at least 2 of them were writing memoirs, very slowly, and only on Thursdays. But despite the satin and suggestion, what happened after midnight was often more mundane than scandalous. Hair was unpinned and brushed out in long, languid strokes, while someone recited lines from a play they half remembered. Petticoats were soaked in lavender and vinegar solutions, while shoes were stuffed with newspaper to hold their shape. There was a kind of sisterhood in this odd, laced-up ritual of unlacing. They'd rib each other, yes, but they also watched each other's backs like soldiers in a very sparkly trench. In the upstairs attic, converted into a kind of ad hoc reading parlour, Gracie lit a tiny oil lamp and curled up with her favourite book, a tattered volume of Greek philosophy that smelled faintly of candle wax and pipe tobacco. She'd once read a passage from Plato to a particularly rowdy miner to calm him down. To everyone's astonishment, it worked. He sobered up and tipped her a gold nugget the size of a walnut. Philosophy, it turned out, had better market value than anyone expected. And yes, there were secrets. Letters from past lives tucked into pajama drawers, an engagement ring worn on a chain and never spoken of, crude scratchings in the attic wall made by a woman who'd once worked here and vanished one summer night. "Took off for Paris," they liked to whisper, though the nearest Paris was in Texas and not known for its fashion salons. But even the secrets grew drowsy around 2 a.m. That's when the whiskey mouthwash was spat into chamber pots, when makeup tins were closed with little clicks like punctuation at the end of a long sentence, and when the house madam played her tiny music box just once like a signal, for it was truly bedtime now. The brothel grew quieter still, the only sound the soft crackle of dying coals, and the delicate creak of bedsheets being turned down. Outside, the wind had settled for the night, meandering lazily through cactus and mesquite. And inside, behind doors painted in shades of rose and ivory, tired shoes had been kicked off and dreams slipped on. As the last lamp was dimmed and one girl hummed the melody of a song no one remembered the words to, a soft snore rose from the hallway, part lullaby, part proclamation. And down in the parlor, the old grandfather clock ticked on, patiently keeping time for the curious hours to come. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, either because it was hungry, heartbroken, or just had a flair for the dramatic. Inside, the air of the brothel was still and perfumed, heavy with the scent of rosewater and cabbage stew. The stew was courtesy of Maudie, the cook who claimed to have once poached a pheasant for President Rutherford B. Hayes, though the general consensus was she once mistook a turkey buzzard for a candle holder, and thus her stories were treated with some culinary skepticism. It was now comfortably past midnight. The piano, having lost stamina and half its lilting sense of tune, had gone quiet. But contrary to what dime store westerns might suggest, the real business of the brothel didn't involve swinging saloon doors and uproarious laughter deep into the wee hours. In fact, most of the tomfoolery wound down long before the rooster had even begun to consider his career options. What really happened after midnight in the more respectable brothels, such as Madame Odette's Velvet Lantern, just 2 clicks west of the cattle trail, tended to look far less like a whiskey-drenched fever dream, and far more like a rather loopy version of bedtime at an all-girls finishing school. By 12:30, the ladies of the house had slipped into their flannel nightrobes, selected more for warmth than seduction, and settled into their post-work rituals. Luella, who could recite nearly the whole of Byron's Don Juan from memory and had a formidable collection of Shakespeare plays marked up with suggestive commentary in the margins, liked to unwind with a cucumber on her eyes and a bottle of sarsaparilla clutched in hand like a holy relic. Gertie, the redhead with the laugh that could knock hats off at 50 paces, took to mending stockings while humming German lullabies her grandmother had sung back in Bavaria. Of course, no one else could quite tell if it was German or just an inventive form of sleep humming that had evolved after years of broken sleep and bourbon dreams. Then there was Miss Maisie, affectionately dubbed the Night Librarian, not because she had any credentials, but because she maintained a mighty stash of books hidden behind a false panel in her wardrobe. These weren't just any books, they were banned books, books about anatomy, French poetry, astrology, and one suspiciously dog-eared guide called How to Woo a Railroad Baron in 7 Days or Less. After hours, Maisie would sometimes read aloud, her voice gentle and theatrical, to a small circle of half-asleep listeners reclining on mismatched fainting couches. The reading hour was part gossip, part education, and part stifled giggles, peppered with such interjections as, "Wait, is a duke better than an earl?" And, "I still say there's no such thing as a love line on your palm, you're just sweaty." It wasn't all lavender sachets and literary salons, of course. There were chores. Floors swept, perfume bottles recorked, curlers removed from hair that had spent the evening defying gravity and common sense. The brothel cat, a 3-legged tabby with the profound name of Senator, took this as the ideal time to re-establish dominion over the furniture by vomiting precisely once in each room, always with tactful timing. And Madame Odette herself, formerly Odile Deschamps of Montmartre, or so she claimed, would descend from her private quarters with hair braided like a Viennese pastry and cheeks proudly unrouged. In a whisper, that carried oddly well. She'd inspect the house, nod at straightened doilies, and sip her chamomile tea while muttering about the absurd detail of local fire codes. Why, yes, Jeremiah, let me just install a full-size fire cart in the powder room. That makes sense. There were policies too. After midnight protocols more meticulous than you might expect. No gentlemen callers, no gambling after curfew, no riding of horses indoors again. This rule was instated after a particularly spirited birthday celebration for Clemency Boots Malone. And absolutely no seances unless you use the proper tablecloth, the one without gravy stains. It is said that this sacred after midnight time was when the walls whispered most, the wood creaked with the secrets of the day, and laughter gave way to the kind of contemplative silence that only emerges after a third helping of cornbread and 4 bad decisions. Though the life inside the brothel was certainly unconventional, what happened after midnight was, in truth, quite ordinary. Just women working, resting, and finding slivers of peace in a world that frequently mistook them for scandal with petticoats. Outside, the moon peaked, then began its slow slide toward dawn, and the velvet lantern settled deeper into its dreamy hush. And in one second-floor bedroom, the conversation shifted from romantic poetry to revolvers, because it turns out both require good trigger technique and a firm grip. But revolvers and romance could wait for another dreamy detour. In the velvet silence of post-midnight hours, the clamour of the saloon had usually dwindled to the gentle clink of a forgotten bottle or the raspy snore of a card player who mistook the felt table for a feather bed. And in the brothel just above or adjoining, depending on the architecture of vice that week, things took a turn from scandalous spectacle to something oddly mundane. Here's the secret that catches most people off guard. After midnight, many of the Wild West's so-called houses of ill repute became, wait for it, surprisingly domestic. Less Moulin Rouge, more midnight, Martha Stewart. By this hour, the paint was smudged, the corsets were loosened, and the wigs, yes, wigs were quite the tool of the trade, were carefully brushed out and placed on porcelain heads, peering like silent ghosts in the flickering shadows of kerosene lamps. The coin had been made, or not, and now the madams turned to their second job. Housework, gossip, and late-night tea so strong it could strip the glaze off a teacup. Imagine the soft shuffle of slippers on creaky wood floors, the low murmur of women recounting the evening's odd guests, the preacher, the travelling dentist, the cowpoke who insisted on paying in pumpkins. Laughter bubbled under their breath, never too loud, always aware that the sheriff's office was merely a stumble down the boardwalk and entirely too nosy for anyone's comfort. And the cat, of course. There was always a cat. Brothels had a mythical attraction to cats, usually scraggly creatures with 1 tuft of fur and 17 personality disorders between them. In one famous bordello in Cheyenne, the cat was known to nap in only 2 places, the pianola or the lap of the sternest madam in Wyoming, a woman named Maud who could fold linen into weaponized origami. That cat saw more drama than most historians, and he never spoke a word. Wise, really. If you tiptoed into the parlour around 1 a.m., you may have found a few girls stitching repairs into their gowns, threading gently by lamplight, replenishing torn ruffles from overzealous Texas Rangers or overly optimistic tobacco barons. They joked about starting a sewing circle, and some actually did. There's record of one brothel advertising needlework club meetings as a sort of coded invite for more interactive gatherings, or perhaps they really did just enjoy embroidery. History, like gossip, can be hard to verify after 2 drinks and 100 years. Meanwhile, the madams went over ledgers. Yes, ledgers. Because behind every risque wink was an economy, humming along with the precision of a steam engine. These women were accountants in petticoats. Every room rental, every drink served, every hairpin found on the stairs. It was all noted, balanced, and tallied. Some brothels even issued tokens, small brass coins stamped with hearts or initials, redeemable for services. They were tracked, counted, and collected with more care than poker chips in a professional game. And then there were the quiet ones, the working girls who slipped into their more personal rituals. A letter half written to a family back east, a lock of hair braided and hidden in a drawer, an aging locket with a face no one asked about. These were the hours when the persona peeled off like stage paint, when the woman underneath emerged, tired, hopeful, often deeply funny in that beautiful way pain finds its punchlines. Naturally, there were minor catastrophes now and again. A cowboy passed out in the dumbwaiter, a visiting magistrate attempting polite conversation through the haze of laudanum and pride, mismatched boots discovered in compromising locations, pillow fights that were less playful and more territorial conflicts over blanket rights. But mostly, it was stillness, unoiled hinges sighing, clockwork ticking like a lullaby, a distant harmonica from the bunkhouse wafting forlorn notes through the cracked glass. The West at night wasn't just wild, it was weary. And in these brothel rooms, behind rose-hued curtains and chipped gilded mirrors, life was lived not in salacious scandal, but in the quiet, persistent pursuit of resilience. Even then, femininity wasn't a costume. It was survival stitched with satin and sarcasm. As the first pale hints of dawn edged across the plains, the last cup of tea was emptied, the cat climbed into someone's shawl, and the girls whispered their last laughs for the night. The rooms dimmed, footsteps softened, the hush rolled in like dust settling after a storm. And just as the dusty streets outside began to stretch in the early light, something peculiar unfolded in the drawing room, something involving a mirror, a ghost story, and a tin of God knows what. But that's a curiosity best saved for another hushed moment. Let's not wake the cat. By the time the saloon's piano played its final slurred note and the barkeep had given a half-hearted attempt at shooing out the stragglers, the real business of the brothel was just beginning its midnight bloom. The rooms above, or sometimes below, depending on the town's preferred architectural sins, were far more than dens of whispered pleasure. In fact, after midnight, they became miniature theatres, economic hubs, confidant chambers, and sanctuaries for the disillusioned. Very little of what happened was scandalous, despite what dime novels like to suggest. Most of it was surprisingly domestic. You see, once the lights were low and the whiskey had worn thin, the cowboys, prospectors, and rail workers no longer sought fantasy. They wanted cabbage stew, or someone to help them rub the gravel out of their calloused feet. Maybe even someone who could write a letter back home, to a mother who still believed her son had gone west to become a banker. Miss Lucille, for instance, the madam of the velvet teacup in dead wood, routinely embroidered pillowcases after hours. She also had a thriving side business mending shirts for the very men whose hearts, or wallets, she'd stolen earlier in the evening. She boasted the fastest thimble on either side of the Mississippi and declared herself Queen of the Hemline. Nobody dared challenge that title, not after the incident of the crooked cuff. It's worth noting that many brothel workers were multi-talented. Miss Loretta Bell of the Rusty Halo in Tombstone was, by many accounts, a better chess player than the mayor, He lost 3 pocket watches and a prized mustache comb to her in just the month of March. After midnight, her room often hosted quiet tournaments, the air thick with pipe smoke and strategies muted by the muffled creak of swinging doors. Contrary to popular belief, not every lady of the house was lounging seductively on fainting couches, enveloped in clouds of scandal. Many were practicing their penmanship or reading the latest serial from the East Coast. The serialized adventures of Lady Wigglesworth and the Haunted Ballroom were particularly popular in the spring of 1884. Add a little laudanum, a mouldy orange, and a fireplace that needed constant coaxing, and you'd be surprised how intellectual a brothel could feel after the midnight hour struck. Stella Beans McKinley, known not for her charm but for her chili, took it upon herself to feed the night shift with determination befitting a frontier saint. In the kitchen behind Madame Eugenia's Golden Feather Emporium, she'd hum old Irish lullabies and stir an iron pot the size of a washtub. Her chili had exactly 7 scraps of mystery meat, 11 pepper varieties, and a legal notice from the territorial fire marshal. Outlaws would sneak back from train robberies just to have a bowl. After midnight, that kitchen was a holy place of consolation for lonely gunslingers and exhausted dance girls alike. Meanwhile, brothel cats, those storied soot-coloured creatures with 9 lives and at least 12 secrets, prowled the windowsills long after the town had gone quiet. They were unofficial security, grief counsellors, and occasional accomplices depending on the situation. One cat in particular, known locally as Toothpick Tom, had a taste for molasses taffy and apparently once chased off an entire group of drunken cattlemen who had overstayed their welcome. His legend was only slightly shorter than that of Billy the Kid. And then there were the conversations. Deep, strange, greasy conversations that only blossom in the small hours of forgetfulness. Discussions of railway ownership and buffalo dreams, of the possibility of time travel, or whether horses enjoyed the music of banjos. One silver miner swore up and down he'd seen a family of raccoons performing Shakespeare behind the outhouse. Not a soul doubted him. In the soft candlelight of shared delusion, everyone was an oracle and a poet. This, more than anything, is what the brothel after midnight truly promised. A place where the world slouched, loosened its corset, and revealed its tender, odd, and deeply human heart. Beneath the lace and the smoky air, it was a refuge, not just for indulgence, but for absurd connection, momentary comfort, and chili that could probably cure heartbreak and possibly dissolve iron. Outside, the faint howl of the wind teased the shutters, and the stars did their best to keep secrets. But inside, someone still had laundry to fold, letters to write, and maybe a kitten to rescue from inside a misplaced spittoon. Now then, just down the street, as the lanterns flicker low, something peculiar is happening with a missing pocket watch, a drunken sword swallower, and the town's last honest barber. Beneath the flickering lanterns and lace-curtained parlors of Wild West brothels, an odd little ritual unfolded in the hours after midnight, with the saloon music dwindling to muted piano twinkles and the streets outside gone quiet, but for the soft clop of a distant horse's hooves. This was when the real theatre began. Let us now drift through an unseen door behind the velvet drapes of Madame Estelle's Blue Moon House in Cheyenne, Wyoming, circa 1889. Estelle, a formidable entrepreneur with a pinched eyebrow and a talent for tax accounting that would make a modern-day CPA swoon, presided over her house with the precision of a military general crossed with a southern church lady. And when the last rowdy cowboy stumbled out with his boots laced incorrectly, that's when the girls, who had names like Rosie, Tall Lou, and Pepper, let down the corsets, rolled their eyes at humanity's collective foolishness, and prepared for what they called the Salon de Recovery. Yes, it turns out the sisterhood of the working night had traditions that would rival any 18th century French drawing room, just with more whiskey and a heavier use of foot-soaked bowls. Post-midnight, the parlour transformed. Gone were the poses struck for clientele approval, replaced instead with the slouch of a woman who has spent 6 hours pretending to enjoy someone who used "How much for a smile, sweetheart?" as his opening line. Hairpins went flying like birds set free. Wigs were set respectfully on shelves, and makeup was wiped off with practiced philosophical sighs. If you've ever been backstage after a vaudeville act, it was remarkably similar, except no one handed out feather boas. Those were now being used as makeshift cat toys by the orphans of street cats who wandered in and were promptly adopted. This was also when stories were shared, gossip exchanged, buttons resewn, and the occasional philosophical debate ignited over warm draughts of tea, or more realistically, whiskey of questionable origin. Take Pearl, for example. Pearl had worked in Deadwood, Dodge City, and once, briefly, in San Francisco, before declaring the ocean too moody. She could recite the entire Gettysburg Address backward if given 2 minutes to prepare, but preferred to spend her nights off mimicking the hoity-toity accents of her more affluent clientele. "Oh yes, dearest Edgar, I do find the price of rail freight rather distasteful," she'd say, between mouthfuls of pickled eggs and laughter. You see, camaraderie bloomed in these quiet hours like night flowers in moonlight. And then, of course, there were the ledgers. Prostitutes, contrary to sentimental romance novels and dime store Western pulp, were extraordinarily savvy at money, and far less interested in kissing cowboys by moonlight than in figuring out compound interest. After midnight was when the books came out. Real books, not dime novels, but ledgers that tracked what was owed to whom and how much Madame Estelle had skimmed this week. Numbers scribbled in pencil, pages dog-eared and sometimes fringed with unintentionally poetic whiskey stains. If you peered over a shoulder, politely of course, you'd see columns that would make an economist weep with admiration. The women could predict the ebb and flow of business with uncanny precision. Payday rushes, cattle drives, bootleggers' weekends, charted like lunar phases. Clara, who'd taught herself math based on poker odds, once drafted a 36-point strategy for expanding into adjacent counties, and it wasn't half bad. It's also worth noting that the concept of employee benefits emerged here after hours through a process of barter, community, and banding together, not just for survival, but for dignity. If someone fell ill, Ivy with consumption, or Mabel with heartbreak, the others pitched in, cooked broth, sent for medicine, sent for, banished bad-tempered clients with deadly accuracy and shoes flung like missiles. This wasn't just a workplace, it was a family, albeit one with sharp tongues and better posture than your average choir group. And yes, there were often visiting musicians curled up on sofas, payment-deferred poets who traded verses for coffee, and one time, very memorably, a traveling hypnotist who offered free sessions in exchange for a hot bath and someone to listen to his regrets. That particular Tuesday night turned into a most elegant performance that ended with everyone believing briefly they were ducks. By the time dawn tickled the edges of the sky and amber light spilled onto splintered wooden floors, things quieted once more. The girls, now laughing softer, yawning wider, would retreat to their rooms, some small, some not so much, and melt into their pillows. Their dreams didn't always match the myths written about them, but in those pre-dawn hours, with the tap of rain on a tin roof and the lull of sleep pulling gently at their bones, contentment sometimes whispered, just for a while. And farther down the corridor, in a room behind a green-painted door, something extraordinary was being stirred. Not a scandal this time, but something even more rare in these shadow-lit brothels. A plan, one stitched together slowly with ink, stolen ledgers, and a purpose fueled not by love or vengeance, but by business. But will unravel that quiet little conspiracy. Soon, the midnight hour in a Wild West brothel was not, as some might imagine, a parade of lace and lantern-light seduction choreographed to the distant sound of saloon pianos. No, by midnight, most of the pianos had gone quiet, either because the pianist had passed out into his own whiskey, or because the keys had been punched one too many times by drunken fists insisting they could play Scott Joplin by ear. Instead, the real business in many brothels had quietly shifted from performance to negotiation. And not the sort of negotiation you might expect. For instance, one of the least glamorous but most crucial of midnight brothel activities was inventory. Yes, inventory. The madam, decked out in velvet robes and fierce curlers, would often descend into the musty back room to conduct an accounting session that would rival any modern startup trying to balance its books before tax season. She'd count bottles of cologne, fancy, kerosene for lamps, essential, and French letter supplies, a charming euphemism for early prophylactics that were about as effective as a lace umbrella in a thunderstorm. And then there was the laundry. One might assume that glamorous garments just appeared magically each evening, ribbons pre-poofed, corsets crisp to near engineering standards. But by midnight, soiled silks and perspiring petticoats began their nightly journey, hauled in overflowing baskets to the basement or backyard wash stations. The laundresses, often women, themselves laboured into the small hours, boiling water in vats the size of whiskey barrels and scrubbing with lye soap so fierce even the stains gave up. It's easy to forget how involved hygiene was in an age before indoor plumbing. A hot bath wasn't just a luxury. It was a strategic business decision. Many brothels kept their tin bathtubs humming with activity well past midnight. This was less about cleanliness and more about competition, because in a town where 20 saloons shared one street, having an upstairs room with steamy water and maybe even a fresh bar of soap was as good as any billboard. Now, while the tubs swirled and the ledgers were tallied, the women who worked the brothel might finally begin to unwind. Contrary to the tales told in cowboy pulp novels, they weren't pacing the halls draped in mystery after midnight. They were often in the kitchen, curled around a tin coffee pot, feet bare and swollen, gossip flowing faster than the teapot's whistle. The hay shared secrets of which cowboys smelled the least like horses, who paid in silver versus scribbled "I owe us," and which newcomers were lying about being Harvard men. Spoiler, most of them. Some women told stories of homes back east, packages of peppermint sent by distant aunts, or dreams of owning a millinery shop where nobody had to dance with sweaty cattlemen on payday. One popular pastime in the wee hours was sewing. Not for virtue, heavens no, but necessity. Stockings torn by boots, corset laces snapped by enthusiastic rookies. Everything had to be mended. Some enterprising women even learned to sew little coin pockets into their underskirts to keep their hard-earned money hidden from both pickpockets and particularly persuasive gamblers. And then there were the pets. Yes, many brothels had them. Not the hoity-toity lapdogs or Instagrammable cats of our day, but scrappy kittens, half-blind owls, and the occasional unofficial raccoon who'd learned how to open the door with its clever little paws. One infamous establishment in Nevada even had a pet goat, Elmer, who once chewed a sheriff's boot while court proceedings were underway upstairs. Nighttime was when these animals came to life, providing warmth, amusement, and the occasional chewed velvet cushion. As silence slowly blanketed the creaky floorboards, a few of the women would slip away to their rooms, their laughter fading, their oil lamps dimmed to a whisper. And from the corner office, if you could call a wine crate and a writing pad an office, the madam would finish penning her final note of the night, often about which client had compliments worth remembering and which ones owed more than just apologies. Outside, the desert air cooled. Somewhere coyotes chuckled at moonlight jokes, and inside, the last of the coffee cooled in its tin pot, forgotten on a chipped table next to a half-stitched handkerchief. But of course, not every brothel kept so quiet after midnight. There were stranger, rituals, mysterious guests, and whispered deals that would make even the saloon ghosts raise an eyebrow. Let's drift toward one of those more curious establishments where midnight was only the beginning. As the hour inched past midnight and the moon cast long silver shadows across the rickety wood-planked streets of Deadwood, Dodge, and dusty Tombstone, something rather unglamorous and absolutely indispensable clattered into motion inside the brothels of the American West, the sacred ritual of post-client cleanup. Now, we may imagine the Old West brothel as an opera of lace, love songs, and a mysteriously endless supply of feather boas. But alas, the gritty truth was far soapier. Quite literally. You see, after the cowboys shuffled out, hauling the musk of whiskey and trail dust in their wake, the brothels slipped into their second shift, a peculiar quiet, busy with tidying, tea brewing, and very unofficial therapy sessions featuring a rocking chair and a borrowed bottle of sherry. Madams led the charge. These were not wallflowers with clipboards, but strategic dynamos who combined the executive authority of a banker with the observational prowess of a poker dealer. Take Madame Fanny Porter, for example, who operated out of San Antonio. Fanny employed only when she had a reported 3-to-1 charm to reliability ratio. Think less desperate frontier dame, more CEO with a petticoat and a pump-action shotgun. After the last client's boots finished thudding down the stairs, it was always clear who wore spurs and who did not. The focus turned to resetting the ambience. Candles were snuffed and replaced, perfumed linens laundered if one were lucky, or discreetly flipped and shaken out if the laundry was feeling negotiable that night. Good velvet was hard to come by on the high plains, so you either adapted or you shipped it in from a Sears catalogue and prayed for the best. Within the rooms, spent corsets lay draped like exhausted cats over chairs, while half-finished whiskey tumblers sat sweating beside dog-eared volumes of poetry, proving that even in the most transactional of entanglements, a little Dickinson never hurt. Ladies of the evening washed up, sometimes with bucket water so icy it would make a rattlesnake faint. In the relative privacy of the wash basin, they coaxed curls back into place and massaged wrists sore from too tight stays. They whispered inside jokes, and sometimes Gwen would mimic Deputy Hargrove's beard shimmy with such pinpoint comedic timing that Opal nearly dropped her soap entirely. And then came the belly business. No matter how many petticoats a woman had twirled in, nor how many charming fibs she'd spun to a homesick railroad worker, hunger was a force stronger than any Colt 45. In kitchens that smelled of lard, onions, and a hint of someone's leftover cherry pipe tobacco, the girls would gather. Catering mostly to themselves, they prepared meals, which ran the dignified range from rabbit, stew to exactly 3 boiled beans and a cracker shared like communion. But always there was hot coffee, usually black, always bitter. Like Miss Lillian's view of men who tipped in Confederate scrip. It's worth noting that the women didn't only scrub the rooms, they swapped stories, compared notes on their clientele, the one with the bandit tattoo and 2 left boots, and conducted mutual analyses worthy of Harvard behavioral psychologists. What men wanted was rarely what they claimed, and these women, armed with unflinching observation, could have written the West's most honest romance novels. Had publishers been more interested in stories with bed-frame creaks and economic insight. Downstairs, the parlor morphed into a casual lounge. A battered piano, its keys badly wobbling when pushed, attempted something like ragtime. The tune fluttered around low voices, the kind tired enough to only finish their jokes halfway. And yet, there was laughter too, low, nasal, occasional and strange. The kind of laughter that happens only at 3 a.m. when exhaustion makes everything twice as funny and 10 times more true. Little by little, boots thumped up narrow staircases, lamps dimmed with a hiss or flicker, and woolen blankets were pulled up over knees that had known hard saddle rides and harder long nights. The girls dozed off in rooms that carried secrets in every floorboard. Tonight had brought no brawls, no broken chamber pots, and only 2 mix-ups between twins. A win by Wild West standards. Outside, the silence began to soak back into the streets, disturbed only by a wayward donkey and the occasional piano key mournfully struck by the physicist/barkeep/bellboy trying to recall a mazurka from memory. Inside, a hush settled like dust after a stampede, and in one corner of a dim top-floor room, a woman named Ruby adjusted her stockings by the dim light of dawn and wondered, not for the first time, what became of people who left. She sighed and reached for her stockings again. Morning was only a few hours away, and the man with the prize bull tattoo would be back. He always came with the sun. And far from fading into sleep just yet, the brothel had one more secret to whisper before the morning's coffee brewed. As the whiskey lamps flickered and the grand piano downstairs yawned into silence, something curious began to stir in the upper rooms of the more luxurious brothels, the kind with velvet drapes and faint European wallpaper patterns, slightly warped by desert heat and unruly clients. Midnight in the Wild West, you see, wasn't just the hour when cowboys finally passed out with their boots still on. It was also the hour when things calmed down just enough for the women of the parlor houses to finally take a breath. And that's when the truly unexpected happened. Contrary to the popular dime novel dramatics, not every brothel night ended in scandal or saloon shootouts. Sometimes, after, the moneyed cattle barons had snored themselves into oblivion, and the piano player had traded his whiskey glass for a wash basin. The upstairs hallways became quieter than a prospector's conscience. This was when the madam, often dressed in less lace and more flannel than you'd expect, might gather her girls for what could only be described as a salon of sorts. Yes, a salon. Not the hairstyling variety, but the kind where people sipped tea and argued politely about poetry, while pretending not to hear the occasional thunderous snores vibrating through the walls. In these late hours, women like Julia Bulette of Virginia City, or Dora Dufran of Deadwood, madams whose business sense could rival the best railroad magnates, would brew coffee over a sputtering stove and talk shop. Not shop as in accessorizing, but literal economics, inventory, supply and demand, hygiene routines, the price of imported French soap. One could say a brothel's attic at midnight was the Harvard Business School of Frontier America, only with more fringe and fewer textbooks. And don't think for a second these women were passive observers of their own fate. After midnight, with hairpins out and corsets loosened, they shared notes like seasoned investors. What tricks work best on railroad surveyors? Could you really predict a miner's tip based on the color of his hat? Who was secretly married and who just left his wife in Omaha 4 saloons ago? They were, in a sense, data analysts in petticoats. Some kept ledgers so intricate they might have made a banker blush. Little symbols next to customers' names, stars for big tippers, lightning bolts for troublemakers, tiny pine trees for those who smelled faintly of forest and therefore needed extra soap. All this, while their clients dreamed blissfully of poker winnings they didn't have and cattle herds they never owned. And then there were the letters. After midnight, under the soft glow of oil lamps, many working girls took pen to paper. Some wrote to sweethearts they fully intended to return to, others to aging parents who still thought their daughters were tutors or seamstresses in Kansas City. The Postal Service, surprisingly, made this possible. Even in dusty frontier towns, the U.S. Postal Service was doggedly reliable, which meant that many a mother in Ohio received carefully constructed letters filled with edited truths and floral stationery. It also meant that sometimes, when a girl packed up and left, she might leave a bundle of unsent letters behind, tucked in drawers, folded between ledger pages, or hidden under creaky floorboards, waiting patiently for someone to care. Sometimes, these attic hours took on an almost sacred quiet, a kind of hush that fell over the rooms, broken only by the distant clink of a swinging sign or the pursuit of a mouse who'd gotten lucky in the leftover snacks department. You might hear someone softly plucking a banjo, not for show, but for solitude. Or 2 women trading love poems they'd heard from a passing soldier. Some tried their hand at embroidery, which, judging from surviving examples, was either a cherished stress relief or an absolute disaster. Even the cat, because yes, nearly every brothel had a half-wild cat that roamed the stairs like it owned stock in the building, seemed to settle in a little after the patrons fell silent, lounging on discarded feather boas with the confidence of royalty. And so, while conventional history focused on the noise and the nonsense, these after-hours moments tell a different story, a quieter one, of women who found community and routine inside chaos, of camaraderie stitched together during stolen moments between the noise. Because after midnight, the Wild West didn't always roar. Sometimes it just exhaled. And somewhere beyond the rickety front doors, a coyote howled, not out of menace, but as if joining the chorus of dreams settling in for the night. The piano gathered dust, the whiskey cooled, and a warm conversation upstairs turned to laughter, then whispers, then sleep. And as the oil lamp dimmed to a low golden flicker, another story waited to unfold just beyond the sway of the curtains. As the clock hands crept toward the peculiar hour of 2:07 a.m., which seemed to be the unofficial tea time of ghosts, gamblers, and overly opinionated cats, the brothel's upstairs hallway had grown quieter, save for the occasional floorboard groaning beneath decades of secrets. Lantern light flickered like a sleepy firefly, casting amber waves over peeling wallpaper patterned with vine-like swirls that may have once looked Parisian, but now mostly resembled parsley gone rogue. On the third floor of Madame Claudette's house of refreshment, a name chosen more for its flirt with legality than accuracy, 3 parlors hummed with the low murmur of post-midnight philosophy. Yes, philosophy. The brothel, oddly enough, became something of an accidental symposium after dark. Once the saloons had gone dry and the laughter had softened to a purr, the women and their favoured guests, drunken poets, out-of-work pickpockets, and the occasional wandering taxidermist, would meander into comfortable conversations by kerosene lanterns, wrapped in shawls and shared stories. Ladies like Miss Rose, who insisted she had once danced for Emperor Maximilian's cousin, a claim historians neither confirmed nor denied due to excessive eye-rolling, held sway over these discussions with the gentle force of someone who had been almost famous and rather liked the feeling. Her parlour, known unofficially as the Crimson Vestibule, became a haven for late-night debates on subjects ranging from spiritualism to the critical ethics of stealing someone's boots in a poker game. On one particularly drowsy Tuesday morning, or possibly Monday, depending on whose memory you trusted, Rose and a regular patron named Mr. Ellsworth engaged in a spirited debate over whether ghosts had better manners than the living. Rose, wrapped in a quilt patterned with sunflowers and suspicion, nodded sagely while puffing a hand-rolled cigarette. "Well, at least a ghost knocks," she declared. "Even the dead have the decency to tap thrice before floating in. More than can be said for most railroad men." Down the hall, a tall, angular woman known only as Beatrice the Indecipherable read old detective stories aloud to a crowd of rapt listeners who had either paid in full or offered up decent moonshine. Beatrice had a voice like warm whiskey, a little rough, very smooth, and prone to poetic tangents about the architectural merits of saddle horn design. She believed that mystery novels, when read under gaslight with one's feet in a basin of warm water, could cure most heartbreaks, or at least distract you until the next paycheck. It was in these hours, when the rowdy clients were asleep or gently snoring into velvet settees, that the soul of the brothel revealed itself, less a house of sin, and more like a nocturnal salon with better wallpaper and a penchant for rosewater. Even Opal, the stoic barkeep, who kept an eye from downstairs with a Winchester shotgun that doubled as a coat rack, softened around this time. She brewed coffee thick enough to be legally classified as architecture and served it to the girls with a touch of cinnamon and caution. Now, it would be a historical disservice, not to mention that the illicit trade was very much still present. Things were not all midnight musings and hand-holding over biscuits, but history is a tapestry, not a single thread, and the quieter, untold moments were its golden seams. These women, so often reduced in dusty ledgers to initials beneath lists of nightly earnings, were also caregivers, comedians, sometimes reluctant therapists, and nocturnal philosophers with a flair for improvisational jazz, if you count enthusiastic humming. And floating just beneath those late hours, like the hum of a faraway train or the whisper of wind before a thunderstorm, was something more, an invisible thread of companionship. For many of the men who arrived hoping for a few hours of warmth, what they stayed for was often conversation. Human connection cost far more than whiskey and was infinitely harder to fake. And so, the night drifted onward under the roof of Madame Claudette's, swaddled in whispers, laughter, and the occasional spat over who got the last piece of molasses taffy. Out the windows, the desert stars hung heavy above the silent prairie, flickering like they were eavesdropping on each word. Just as Beatrice reached the final chapter of the adventures of Inspector Whippoorwill, and Rose launched into a poetic soliloquy about her time in coastal Albania. Spoiler, she meant Galveston. The first glimmer of light scratched at the horizon, soft and peach-tinted, as if the sun, too, were quietly easing back into the world. And so, with the candles flickering toward their end and Opal pouring the last of the night's coffee, the brothel settled gently into that suspended hush between dark and day, a moment when history seems to blink slowly, like a cat warmed by the stove. But down in the storage room, something curious was beginning. Velvet curtains being adjusted, a strange rattling of gears, and a crate labelled performing automaton, handle with ambiguity. You see, the invention of the West's first mechanical burlesque dancer had arrived, and not everyone was prepared. By the time the piano's final chord shivered into silence and the last cigar ember burned out in the spittoon, the Wild West brothel entered its second shift, the one the guidebooks failed to mention. Oh yes, the men may have stumbled back to their boarding houses, pockets lighter and heads full of half-remembered verses, but for the women of the house, a whole other world began to awaken. You see, after midnight, the parlor rooms and creaky, upstairs chambers played host not just to tired cowhands and clumsy prospectors, but to an entirely different kind of performance, one that involved ledgers, lemon-scented soap, boot polish, and occasionally a surprising amount of pickled onions. We'll get to the onions. Let's begin with bookkeeping, which was as essential to a brothel as mascara or moonshine. While the mythos of the Wild West might have you believe it was all shootouts at dawn and dames with derringers hidden in garters, most madams were, in fact, remarkably efficient accountants. After the final door had clicked shut and the last customer's spurs clinked down the stairs, out came the ink pots, ledger books, and stubby stubs of pencils that had seen more calculations than a train station ticket clerk during cattle drive season. Every cent was logged, meticulously. Services rendered, percentages owed to the house, breakage fees for a mirror shattered by one particularly enthusiastic silver miner. The HRT mathematics of intimacy, helpfully rounded to the nearest nickel. And why yes, there were tips tracked too. You'd be shocked how often bummers left behind gold filings or patent medicine as gratuities. Upstairs, rooms were cleaned with a quiet busyness. Linens were scoured, basins emptied, and feathers fluffed back into tired pillows that had weathered more sighs than a German poetry recital. Each dresser drawer had to be inspected, carefully, since forgetful clients occasionally left behind odd trinkets. One brothel in Nevada reportedly built a small museum of misplaced items. Antique pocket watches, wedding rings, oh dear. And once, a fully functional dental plate carved from mesquite wood. The night also offered a rare sliver of time for the women to simply be. Slippers replaced boots, corsets unhooked like iron gates being opened after a long journey, and tea, real steaming tea, not the whiskey variety, was passed around like an elixir. Imagine them barefoot before fireplaces, swapping stories the way some folks swap recipes, sharing the dialogue of dreams deferred, and lovers too generous with cologne. Many women in the trade were immigrants, Irish, German, Chinese, and so the late hours might ring out with soft tales in unfamiliar cadence, whispered lullabies to their own worn hearts. It was a sisterhood forged by economics and experience. Not all got along, mind you, but they understood one another in that unspoken way only people who wear similar masks tend to do. And now, let us consider the matter of sustenance. After wrangling the emotions and egos of the territorial West, midnight hunger was a real devil. The brothel kitchen, normally the realm of a no-nonsense cook with arms like stovepipes, simmered back to life. If you imagine candlelit dinners or romantic oysters, think again. It was hash, it was beans, it was cold chicken, possibly won in a poker game. But most beloved of all were the pickled onions. Legend has it, a brothel in Tombstone swore by them for restoring clarity and reducing inflammation of the disposition. As the darker hours unfolded, the madam herself might descend from her quarters, silk robe trailing, spectacles balanced on her nose like a precariously settled hawk. Her job never really ended. Security had to be maintained, especially from the occasional jealous suitor or drunken gambler with the interpersonal finesse of a badger in a brass band. The madam knew everyone, had ears in every parlor, and could eject a misbehaving customer through a second-story window with the strategic assistance of a broom handle and gravity. She was feared, revered, and always knew where the emergency laudanum was kept. There was also reading. Yes, reading. Contrary to popular belief, many of the women shared books, passed from hand to hand with reverence. Shakespeare, penny dreadfuls, French novels with pages suggestively dog-eared. Literacy wasn't as rare as some imagined, and a good book was prized almost as dearly as a day off. And then, as the sky began to barely blush at its edges, a hush would fall across the house. Carpet swept, curtains drawn closed once more, and the brothel slowly exhaled. The world outside would soon stir, sunrise drawing a line between night secrets and day's negotiations. But for now, a last lamp was extinguished. A door creaked gently shut. A woman turned in her narrow bed and tugged a quilt closer. The hush wasn't silence. It was the sound of a moment, suspended like dust in a sunbeam. And just as sleep finally tiptoed in, the doorknob downstairs gave the faintest rattle. Not trouble, just someone knocking, long before they were open, of course. But that little knock, it would lead to something very curious indeed. By the time the oil lamps were turned low and the piano had fallen silent, just an echo of its last honky-tonk chord lingering behind the lace curtains. The brothel had slipped into a different kind of rhythm, one far slower, gentler, and, it must be said, considerably quieter. Midnight, after all, was when the true business of the place took a step back to make room for sausage biscuits, heartfelt confessions, and extremely ungraceful attempts to recite Shakespeare. You see, while common legend would suggest these dens of sin raged like a saloon on payday until dawn, the human body, and especially one wearing stilettos in a corset since 4 p.m., will only tolerate so much. Midnight was the threshold. After that, brothels were less dens of vice and more informal dinner parties with better lighting and worse table manners. Take Miss Loretta Mayfield's establishment in Tombstone, for example. Her parlour might have hosted a whiskey-fueled poker game by twilight, but come moonrise, the girls were in their stockings and slippers, nursing chamomile tea spiked lightly, very lightly, with bourbon. And contrary to popular belief, not every cowboy was banging down doors hoping to meet temptation head-on. Many staggered in from the cold more eager for warmth, reassurance, and an ear willing to tolerate a 3-hour tale about the cow that got away. Some gentlemen, bless their dusty souls, paid simply to talk, real talk, about gold mines that never golded, about a brother lost in the war, about how a man, after his 4th failed cattle investment, sometimes wondered if he'd been meant to be a poet, or maybe just a baker. So the women of the evening became something more like therapists in rouge and velvet. More than one working girl knew the weight of a miner's heart better than a nugget in his pan. Of course, things weren't always so tender. Midnight also brought out the odd patrons who'd had maybe one too many sips of rattlesnake whiskey. That's not a brand name, by the way. Sometimes a snake was literally involved. In such cases, brothel security, often a former outlaw paid more in pie than in coin, would gently escort the more over-enthusiastic clients out using what was charmingly called the business end of hospitality. Back inside, the girls humming softly to themselves while brushing out their curls, engaged in a timeless ritual. Gossip. Oh, the stories traded over lukewarm stew and waxy candles. Who was courting who? What judge had visited incognito in a fake moustache the week before? Whether Clementine's suitor was wealthy or just good at borrowing suits. These midnight moments were not only a reprieve, they were sisterhood served with a side of sarcasm. The rooms upstairs, meanwhile, were holding space for quieter dramas. There were women nursing swollen ankles, counting crumpled bills beneath pillows, and scratching hopeful letters in shaky cursive. Letters that always started with dearest and rarely ended in postage. There were patrons who snored like oxen, and those who, after one round of chess and half a slice of pie, fell asleep sitting up, their hats still on. And let us not forget a truly crucial post-midnight tradition, laundry. Yes, while the movies show ruby lips and candle flames, they rarely depict that most sacred of brothel tasks, spot-checking frilly petticoats while elbow deep in a wash basin. Wet corsets dripped quietly into copper buckets, smelling vaguely of lilacs and decisions. In some towns, the madam would even host a sort of after-hours salon. Not the hair kind, more the philosophical banter over porridge kind. Card sharps, opera singers down on their luck, and ladies with a private fondness for poetry recitations would form a ragtag gathering by the hearth. They discussed Plato, taxes, candy, and whether bathtubs were better made of tin or porcelain. Bathtub debates got surprisingly venomous. It turns out soap preferences can end friendships. So yes, in the still hours after midnight, brothels of the Wild West transformed. They were less about sin and more about human routine. Not every night ended in scandal. Some ended with mending socks, reading penny novels by lantern light, or watching the stars nestled above the rooftops, blinking as if amused. Because behind the velvet curtains and painted smiles lived people, tired, funny, stubborn people, trying, each in their own peculiar way, to make it through another dusty dawn. And just as the crescent moon leaned in to listen, another sound would rise on the horizon, a rooster. Because it turns out, not even brothels can dodge morning forever. But what did the break of day mean for these sleepy sanctuaries of the West? Well, that's where things start to get delightfully practical. The hour had grown quiet, that particular hush that slides in through the cracks of swinging saloon doors and leans up against the weary boots by the hearth. Midnight had long passed, and so had the last round of whiskey apologies and broken poker vows. At this twilight moment, just when the oil lamps fluttered like they, too, were ready to turn in for the evening, inside the more well-run brothels of the Wild West, something both unexpected and deeply human began to unfold. You see, while the portrayals of brothels in frontier towns often skip over everything between drama and scandal, the quieter truth was much more crocheted. Yes, crocheted. Quilting circles by lamplight weren't just for prairie wives and church basements. Even seasoned madams stocked sewing kits, embroidery hoops, and well-worn novels with bent spines and dog-eared pages. After midnight, the painted ladies, corseted and roguish by candlelight, would often shed the day's personas and pick up mending instead. There was Lucille Two-Shot Templeton, who had once frightened a drunk variety performer senseless simply by raising one eyebrow. She was the best in town at sewing buttonholes. Claimed it was her stress relief. 1 stitch per secret, she'd grin, threading her needle with the steady hands of someone who'd seen enough bar brawls to appreciate a finely bound seam. Not far from her, slouched into a velvet armchair that had given up caring 3 owners ago, reclined Esmeralda, known among clientele for her shimmy and within the house for her Russian literature collection. She was slowly introducing the other girls to Dostoevsky at bedtime. He's mostly gloom and guilt, she admitted cheerfully, but it really helps you appreciate breakfast. At this hour, the parlor took on the air of something between a salon and an unusually fancy birdcage. Wig stands leaned like curious onlookers from shadowy corners. The piano, long since silenced for the night, wore a crocheted doily like a bedtime bonnet, and the air smelled faintly of face powder, peppermint schnapps, and the ghosts of arguments gone quiet. The brothel cat, an overweight tabby affectionately named Marshal Mioveric, made his nightly rounds, inspecting rooms with the solemnity of a county judge and occasionally curling up in someone's discarded gloves. It was widely believed that the cat had once belonged to a real-life marshal, or perhaps just liked uniforms. Either way, his moral compass was sharply impartial. He sat equally on laps regardless of misdeeds. Health, too, was a topic of frequent midnight chatter. Contrary to the rough and tumble myths of wanton abandon, many brothels, particularly those led by women who ran their businesses with grit and grim ledgers, instituted hygiene routines that would have impressed a Victorian nurse. There were vinegar baths, metal implements scoured daily, and what passed for medical inspections every fortnight. Though many of these so-called doctors were simply gentlemen who had read half a science pamphlet and owned a hat labelled Doc, the women knew and managed far more than they let on. Though life brought much uncertainty, the power of information passed between rooms, whispered remedies, herbal concoctions, or the word on arrival's scandalous new wallpaper colour functioned like insurance. One, Madame in Cheyenne, even kept a ledger strictly for gossip, colour-coded and alphabetised, calling it the Almanac of Man's Folly. But on this night, in this gentle pause before sleep returned the favour of forgetting, the house was peaceful. You could hear the click of knitting needles keeping rhythm with the occasional sigh. A girl in her nightdress traced tarot cards with a sleepy finger, while another sharpened a pencil for her half-finished letter home. A letter she would never send but still rewrote every month. These small midnight rituals reminded the women who they were beyond the corsets and candlelight. They were readers, stitchers, dreamers, organisers of chaos. For a place so storied with desire, it was also deeply dignified in its own peculiar bathrobe-clad way. And just before the last oil lamp was snuffed, just as Lucille began muttering about a puzzling drop stitch somewhere near the waistband, the old front floorboard gave its signature creak, not from an approaching customer, but from a storm rolling in. Tomorrow would bring more tales, more thunder perhaps, both from nature and the saloon down the street. But for now, as Marshal Miaverick yawned with impressive judgment, and everyone settled under borrowed patchwork quilts, the house drifted into that rarest of Western commodities, quiet. And it was here, in this hush so complete it felt like silk, that something unexpected began to stir in the cellar. Not trouble, but a rather curious delivery. It was somewhere between the rattling clink of the last emptied whiskey glass and the soft creak of shutters settling against the breeze. That curious interval when the saloons went quiet and the coyotes began their off-key lullabies. When one of the more peculiar rituals of brothel life unfolded in hushed tones and shadowed corners. The counting of the socks. Yes, socks. Now, one might think this would be a minor detail in the larger tapestry of Wild West brothel operations, but one would be stunningly underestimating the sheer number of misplaced woolens that could accumulate when men were hurried, drunk, and perhaps mystified by the presence of velvet wallpaper. These socks, most striped, some with odd holes in highly questionable locations, were gathered nightly by the junior girls. "Socking time," Matilda May would whisper without fail, like a priestess invoking sacred ceremony. The youngest of the house, often too green to serve as full companions, were promoted instead to keeper of the warm things. In short, their task was to comb through parlors, bedchambers, and the occasional fainting couch for any hosiery left behind. Each sock was paired, catalogued, and, if intact, placed in a woven basket under the stairs. After 3 days, any unclaimed pair was fair game. And let it be known, dear listener, some of the Whittier girls became masters of sock bartering on slow evenings. But, as practical as this task was, the sock tally was only the beginning of what truly happened after midnight. Once the last cowboy had clattered away, hat crooked and horse equally tipsy, the house turned strange and soft. The madam, in her dressing gown with a cigar no one dared question, usually took the first bath. "If you soak too long, your conscience might wash in," she'd joke, toes poking out from the edge of a clawfoot tub that squeaked like a hymn every time she moved. Meanwhile, downstairs, the girls would gather around the parlor stove, dresses exchanged for threadbare gowns and hair unpinned at last. It was a moment of collective exhale, where each could set down the persona worn for hours on end. They didn't speak much. Voices were saved like candles, meant to flicker only when needed. Instead, they played cards. Not poker, too competitive, but a lazy kind of solitaire that required neither thought nor stakes. Others would embroider, an ironic hobby considering most of what they stitched would never see daylight. One girl named Clara once spent 3 weeks embroidering a peacock on her corset. "Because if I must suffer," she said, "let me do so with flair." Food came next, but forget imagined decadence. Midnight meals in the brothel were surprisingly humble affairs. Biscuits, if the cook had managed a batch before falling asleep in her rocking chair, thick with flour and snores. Sometimes canned peaches, if someone had charmed the store clerk that week. And always lukewarm coffee, more mud than beverage, but sacred nonetheless. In this gentle murmur of activity, the house cats, no fewer than 3, and all somewhere between vicious and grandiose, slinked through silk skirts and tried their best to access the sugar bowl. The cats, unlike most of the clientele, were there for love, or at least adoration. One in particular, a ginger tyrant named Rutherford B. Hayes, was known to curl up on the girls' laps as though he too had endured a long night of pretending. Sometimes, however, the quiet was broken by music. Not professional music, mind you. Not saloon-worthy piano or parlor crooning, but something smaller, more tender. Lucille had a harmonica, so dented it could only play 3 notes, all slightly off, like a melody recalled from a dream and told through a tin can. She would sit at the base of the stairs and play it softly, like she was trying not to wake the memories drifting above. It was during those moments, when socks had been counted, cats settled, and lukewarm coffee gulped with the dignity owed to champions, that the frontier's most unnoticed community exhaled in rhythm. These women, often written off as silhouettes and scandal, became real here, more themselves than anywhere else in town. One of them, a tall, quiet girl they all called Ivy, though no one could recall if it was her real name, liked to recite poems, from memory no less. "Tonight," she murmured from some crumpled sonnet, her syllables floating like sleep, "and when the stars come out like spilled salt across black velvet skies." But that, dear one, is a story of its own. And salt-shaken skies await us still, just around the corner of another midnight. Outside, the wind sighed through the slats in the clapboard walls like a nosy neighbour eavesdropping on the midnight confessions inside. The lamps were turned low, their flicker softened by gauzy curtains and the occasional plume of cigarette smoke curling upwards like lazy ghosts. While the saloons had long since clattered their final piano keys and locked up their bottles for the night, the brothel pulsed with its own curious rhythm, one somewhere between a whispered diary entry and a misfired fireworks show. By now, most of the town's respectable citizens, and those merely trying to fake it, were asleep, twitching through dreams of cattle, poker winnings, or the sheriff's daughter. But inside Madame Tallulah's parlour, the midnight hour was not a signal for silence. It was the beginning of something undeniably stranger. Tallulah, whose real name wasn't Tallulah, but liked the ring of it better than Edna, was not merely a madam. Oh no, she was something closer to a nocturnal queen presiding over a court of lace, lamp oil, and intrigue. Her girls, who ranged in age from barely legal to stubbornly eternal, had just completed the working hours and were now in what Tallulah called moon repose. In practice, it looked like a blend of decompressing gossip and drinking questionable sherry from cups shaped like boots. This was the hour when the brothel transformed from a business to something more resembling a club for odd souls, with nowhere else to be, and too many opinions about the quality of mustache wax. Pearl, the redhead with a laugh like a goose in a silk scarf, played slow tunes on a harmonium that should have been retired decades prior. Ruby, who claimed she'd once met Oscar Wilde but may have actually just seen a man reading one of his books, recited poetry she claimed to have written but clearly plagiarized from somewhere east of Kansas. And there, in the rocker by the window, sat Frankie Faye. She didn't work anymore, not officially, but lingered in the brothel like a grandmother who refused to die just because she wasn't wanted at breakfast. Frankie Faye possessed tales for every outlaw, oil baron, or traveling dentist who had ever passed through. And after midnight, lubricated by peppermint schnapps and a running fire in her bones, she became a one-woman vaudeville act. Tonight, she was mid-saga about the one-eyed cattle rustler who charmed two barmaids and convinced a coroner he was dead just to miss a court date. "It worked," she cackled, swigging from a flask covered in imitation emeralds. "He got out of town and came back 2 months later as his own cousin." The girls howled. Even Tallulah smirked, though she kept busy wiping down the coins from the evening's work, a necessary ritual since many customers seemed to believe in tucking silver dollars into the most inconvenient places. Not all nights were filled with such levity. Sometimes the parlour quieted, and the girls sang lullabies from their childhoods. Songs half remembered from Kansas porches, Appalachian valleys, or a tenement near the docks of New York. There was comfort in the harmony, though none of them would admit to needing it. Because after midnight, you didn't talk about the lonely old banker who never said a word, just paid to sit beside someone and hold their hand. You didn't mention the miner who asked to be read aloud to, or the teenage cattle driver who only wanted someone to brush his hair like his mama used to. These stories weren't scandalous enough for the saloons, but too tender to forget. No after hours, the brothel wasn't just a den of carnal commerce. It was a hush-hushed sanctuary of peculiar healing. It stitched together the frayed edges of men and women too proud to cry in the daylight. Outside, a coyote barked at the moon, and no one paid it any mind. Tallulah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her court wind down. "You'll better get to bed," she said softly. "We got 2 Pullman cars of railroaders coming in tomorrow, and I don't plan on doing their laundry for 'em." A few good-natured groans rose from the armchairs and fainting couches, but eventually, slippers shuffled over creaky floorboards, and the saloon girl sanctuary dissolved into its respective rooms. The harmonium gave a final, off-key sigh, and as the oil lamps flickered into stillness, silence settled over Madame Tallulah's, save for one final voice, Ruby's, half asleep and murmuring, "You think that rustler's cousin ever paid taxes?" No one answered. Elsewhere in town, in places where the law wore polished boots and the ink on business ledgers gave no hint of the night's true events, something else was stirring. Something involving poker, parlor curtains, and an unusual number of pineapples. But that's a story for another hush-filled hour. At the stroke of midnight, when the poker hands had been laid down and the pianola had played her final, slightly flat rendition of Camptown Races, the bordellos of the Old West slipped into a quieter kind of chaos. One less about whiskey-fueled whooping and more about squeaky floorboards, whispered confidences, and the eternal struggle of corsetry versus comfort. It was the hour when boots were unbuckled, petticoats rearranged into pillow forts, and the madam's cat finally dared to cross the saloon floor unthreatened. You see, behind the velvet curtains stitched with more ambition than thread count, there unfolded a world far more tender than tawdry. After the patrons stumbled off into the darkness, hats askew, pride bruised, and wallets noticeably lighter, the real pulse of the parlor began, and it beat not to lust, but to laundry. Yes, in many a madam's establishment, after the paying clientele had taken their leave, the staff embarked upon what might arguably be the true profession of the Wild West brothel, an overnight laundering operation. With no modern detergents in sight, these women used a potent mix of elbow grease, lye soap, and moonlight to scrub away the sins of the evening. Petticoats, chemises, and satin ribbons were hung like ghostly bunting along backyard clotheslines, fluttering in the prairie wind next to yesterday's bloomers and the occasional unclaimed sock. Inside, things were no less industrious. Parlors were swept, lamps re-oiled, and ledgers meticulously updated in tight, upright handwriting that would put a 19th century accountant to shame. For all the public perception of lawless debauchery, brothels were often paragons of efficiency, operated with all the cold precision of a Swiss railway timetable. If the train conductors wore rouge and had a fondness for vol au vent pastries, and speaking of pastries, midnight also heralded another sacred ritual, the sneaky snack hour. While clients believed the women of the house dined on champagne and excess, the truth was frequently far more domestic. Molasses cookies hoarded in nightstand drawers, cold beans scooped straight from a tin, and coffee brewed so strong it could file for emancipation. In some brothels, the cook, a role often played by a retired dancer with a limp and a soft spot for pickled eggs, would warm a pot of stew on the cast iron stove. The women would gather, shawls draped over their shoulders, slippers scuffing along the floor, and share the day's absurdities over bowls of broth and communal bread rolls. Amid spoonfuls and sighs, stories were exchanged. Who had tears in their stockings? Who had turned down the overly enthusiastic dentist from Dodge City? Who had discovered a stash of mint candies in the cushion of the red settee? These weren't just idle tales. They were morsels of survival, tiny rebellions, and reminders that behind every satin corset beat a mind alert, opinionated, and occasionally sarcastic. Some brothels maintained a more literary flair. In upscale parlors, where the wallpaper had actual patterns rather than suspicious stains, and where the pianists wore bow ties not just as accessories but as statements of philosophical bent, the performers might retire to read poetry aloud. Yes, even Emily Dickinson, secretly cherished between dramatic recitations and well-timed yawns. And every so often, someone would play a quiet tune on a fiddle or pluck at a guitar gone a little out of tune. The sound would drift up through the floorboards, through the smoky silence of sleeping guests and the half-dozed women, wrapping the brothel in a lullaby of its own making. A tune no less poignant for its improvised chords. Even in the rowdiest of houses of ill repute, where spittoons outnumbered handkerchiefs and a goat had once wandered in and stayed for a month. The after-midnight hours were alarmingly domestic. There was a kind of sacred hush to the whole affair, as if the walls themselves had decided to take a rest from the day's drama. And in that hush, the truth of the place shimmered like heat on the horizon. For in the early morning hours, it was not the customers who held the story, but the women, the real proprietors of the West's whispered legends. They were entrepreneurs, comedians, survivalists, amateur therapists, and sometimes even dentists in training in their own right. They patched each other up, braided each other's hair, and laughed softly into the quiet prairie night. And soon enough, as the sky began to tinge from ink to ash to rose, the parlor would hush entirely. Lamps dimmed, skirts folded neatly on hope chests, and one by one, the women would slip into sleep, cradled by softness hard-earned. But just before dawn, while the rooster still debated whether or not to crow, one final secret stirred, waiting to be unearthed in the hour between candle smoke and coffee. By the time midnight slipped past the oil lamps and the smell of whiskey started to surrender to something softer, maybe lavender perfume, maybe just the first tendrils of sleep sneaking into a room, the brothel wore a different face entirely. By the way, oil lamps lied. They flickered like they were about to burn out any second, and then just kept glowing, stubbornly, until morning, much like Miss Daisy's third corset of the night. See, after the patrons cleared out, staggering, swaggering, or singing impromptu ballads to a dusty moon, the women went about reclaiming the space. The tables still bore the scars of spilled bourbon and poorly told poetry, but the saloons had quieted. The tinny saloon piano, played earlier with vigorous mediocrity, fell silent, and in the hush came something unexpected. Bookkeeping, hot tea, and embroidery. Yes, dear listener, embroidery. Behind the red, velvet and swinging doors of the Wild West's more provocative establishments lay the dullest revolution imaginable, competence. Imagine cowboys barely coherent from $2 moonshine, while upstairs, someone, probably named Tilly or Henrietta, is adjusting the books, calculating earnings to the penny, and deciding how to pay Ruby for the broken chamber pot. Because, lest we forget, a brothel wasn't just a place of vice and velvet. It was first and foremost a business. A well-oiled, occasionally whiskey-stained enterprise with ledgers, shift rotations, and something perilously close to a filing system. So what happened after midnight? Well, let's begin with laundry. The real kind. Have you ever tried hand-washing silk drawers in a tin basin by lamplight? These women did, and often while singing lullabies to their blistered hands. The West may have been wild, but lace doesn't wash itself. Brotherly affection among cowhands may have vanished with the stench of barback, brawling, but sisterhood endured within those walls. After hours, the women came together with peppermint foot balm, chipped mugs of lukewarm tea, and a copy of something scandalous like Godey's Lady's Book. They read aloud to each other in turns, characters given dramatic flourishes, and the audience comprised entirely of women in petticoats fanning their armpits with tired sighs. In this dim sisterhood hour, advice flowed like cheap port wine. How to remove whiskey from a frilly skirt, which sheriff could be trusted, which dentist in Dodge City was least likely to stab your gums on accident or on purpose. It was an odd form of domestic safety net, laid gingerly across a world that hadn't quite decided yet what to do with women who could calculate compound interest while rejecting marriage proposals mid-curl set. And then there were the journals. More than one enterprising madam kept meticulous notes, some of which survive today in dusty family attics or forgotten trunks, buried beneath quilts no one dares unfold. These journals detailed far more than clientele. They documented inflation rates, grain shortages, letters from estranged cousins, and in one case, a detailed essay on the moral hypocrisy of local clergy, with footnotes. Of course, not every brothel had tea and ledgers. Some leaned more toward the chaotic spectrum, with poker games among staff going well past sunrise. Others took a more artistic route. Did you know that Miss Clementine of Deadwood organized midnight poetry slams? She insisted on proper iambic pentameter, even if half her audience thought pentameter was a type of disease you got from wrong thinking in public. There were also pets. Brothel cats, most notably. Beloved, mildly judgmental creatures who took it upon themselves to nap in the most inconvenient places, usually next to a warm iron or directly on the cash register. Dogs large enough to be misunderstood, as bears often stood guard at entrances wearing little bandanas that gave them an air of both menace and mild fashion sense. And then there were dreams, the kind whispered aloud between two beds, or scribbled hastily onto scraps of paper by candlelight. Dreams of owning shops, running schools, or heading west one more time to the Pacific, where things were rumored to be less dusty, where maybe a woman didn't need to explain why she could shoot better than her brother or recite Shakespeare while bandaging a gunshot wound with a monogrammed napkin. By around 3 or 4 in the morning, the sound of snoring overtook even the creaking floorboards. Those still awake lay with blankets pulled to their chins, dreaming deeply not of lacy escapades, but of hot water that didn't come from a kettle, of shoes in the right size, of quiet. And somewhere distant, in the starlit hush, a rooster yawned, an early warning system for the steaming chaos that sunlight would bring. But for now, the red haze of midnight was fading. Another night down, another entry in the ledgers, another mystery knitted, embroidered, or monologued into being beneath a lace-trimmed lampshade. And as the hush deepens, we begin to tiptoe into another room, where something even stranger, and somehow even sleepier, awaits. Somewhere past the creak of wind-blown shutters and the last clink of whiskey glasses in the saloon, the brothel houses of the Wild West began their quiet transformation. Midnight was not the end of the day here. It was the turning of a page. Gone were the stomping boots and slurred propositions of travelling ranch hands. By this hour, things slowed into something resembling, well, a velvet-edged domesticity. You might even call it charming, if charming could wear corsets and play cards better than half the county. Inside one such brothel, perhaps tucked into a side street in Virginia City, or up a dusty hill in Deadwood, the working women transitioned into softer roles. No longer the public performers of flirtation and fanfare, they became hosts of impromptu salons, philosophers in petticoats, hairstylists, amateur dentists, cat wranglers, soup chemists, and, when necessary, stern bedtime enforcers. Because make no mistake, not everyone came to these places for what you'd expect. Some paid dearly just to fall asleep next to someone who wouldn't drink their coffee first and complain about the beans. Others booked time with a particular madam because she'd read them the latest news, aloud, with voices for each character, mind you. One woman in Tombstone was rumoured to possess an impressive collection of dime novels, which she read by kerosene lamp to cowboys who had never learned to read, but longed to know what happened to Dead-Eye Dan in Chapter 6. After midnight, matters of etiquette became strangely important. A gentleman might wait his turn outside in the parlour, where he'd idly shuffle cards or sip tepid tea served in a chipped cup that had once belonged to a senator's sister's maid, or so the story went. The madam, with a gaze sharp enough to iron shirts, enforced the quiet with a look, and while pistols were checked at the door long before curfew, more than one intoxicated loudmouth had been escorted out not with force, but with an exhausting series of questions about his mother's moral upbringing. That kind of guilt lingered longer than a bruise. In these secret hours, stories blossomed like cacti in bloom, briefly, colourfully, and painfully. Women whispered of eastern cities they hoped to reach, businesses they would start once they saved enough money, families they hadn't written to in years. A few played piano, haltingly and from memory, tuneless little things that spilled over the floorboards like molasses. Someone always sang harmony, half an octave low and 3/4 drunk. And then, of course, there were the practical matters. Staying up late invited trouble in the form of buttons in need of sewing, ledgers in need of adjusting, and clients suddenly struck down with crises of conscience. One silver miner once wept for an hour about a mule he lost in a card game. He never mentioned who won the mule, but he cursed them softly as he fell asleep on the fainting couch, leaving behind an apology note and $2 silver. The women knew better than most that these walls were padded not only with sawdust and faded linens, but with stories, and those stories kept the lights on, paid the barkeep's tab, and occasionally kept the sheriff charmingly forgetful. Midnight was also when tin bars were filled, and disputes over lavender oil versus peppermint oil broke out anew. Peppermint was invigorating, but a bit much, according to Clara, who had once dumped an entire vial in the bath and cleared the entire third floor of clients, complaining of nostril frostbite. Lavender, on the other hand, was sedative, beloved by all, and suspiciously rat-attracting. Balance, as always, was key. Still, there was pampering to be had. Feet were soaked. Hair was brushed and coiled into elaborate knots no one saw but each other. Stockings were mended. Ill-fitting corsets were modified with sewing techniques borrowed from military tents. This was care work, invisible and essential, doled out by women for one another in gnarled hands seasoned by life and touching sweetness where the world rarely offered it. Outside, the wind might sigh against the eaves, telling tales of gunfights and horses and some outlaw who was almost definitely shorter in real life. But inside the brothel after midnight, the true legends unfolded quietly, in whispers, in kindnesses passed hand to hand, and in the hush of a place that understood both survival and grace. As oil lamps dimmed and laughter dwindled into murmurs, most souls, even the loneliest ones, felt just a little less forsaken. Now then, there's still one more secret worth slipping your boots off to hear. Let's go a little deeper. It was well past midnight now, and the gas lamps flickered with a sleepy amber sigh. Out on the dusty street, the screech of a faraway owl blended into the muffled creak of a barroom door swinging in some lazy wind. But inside the brothels of the Wild West, those red-lit sanctuaries of velvet and secrets, another world was winding down, and yet still quietly spinning. No more piano pounding merrily in the background now. No tin pan dance tunes or stomping boots trying to impress a mirror. Instead, conversations had shifted to murmurs, some in giggles, others heavy with the kind of sighs that only wide-awake hearts can produce near dozing bodies. For many women who worked in these brothels, the true shifts began long after the beer stopped flowing. One of those nocturnal rituals was known with reverent sarcasm as the Lavender Ledger. No, it was not a secret book of forbidden spells or the code name for a robbery, although both would have made excellent novels. It was in fact a notebook discreetly kept under lock and key, in which each madam recorded detailed notes about the previous evening's clientele. Not for gossip's sake, heavens no. This was administrative wizardry. Whose moustache tickled? Who had the best manners? Who forgot to pay last time and tried to pretend it was all one big philosophical misunderstanding? This book wasn't just a catalogue of quirks, it was protection. It also helped answer deeply consequential managerial questions, such as, who got the good mattress tonight? You see, contrary to mythological depictions of Wild West brothels as endless carnivals of champagne and giggling corsets, the reality was considerably more logistical. Nobody wanted the lumpy bed. Every professional in the building had very strong feelings about the damn springs that poked like rattlers under the sheets. So the ledger settled debates, tracked debts, and occasionally noted that customer number 14 should never, ever be allowed near the mahogany chair again. The reason? Best not to ask. Some of the brothels, especially the slightly wealthier parlor houses, even offered something approaching room service in the dead of night. A sleepy young helper, from the staff, not the guests, would deliver late-night comforts like warm milk, stewed apples, or, in one famous case out of Virginia City, a single peeled grape on a silver plate. That customer tipped poorly, but was never denied his ridiculous grape. Meanwhile, behind heavy curtains and perfumed drapes, women read books, mended stockings, wrote letters to sisters and cousins they missed, or simply stared into oil lamps with the controversial thought that maybe they'd like to open a boarding house someday. Men in bunkhouses always talked about striking it rich. Women in brothels, at least the clever ones, talked about getting out and owning the real estate someday. But there was still warmth in the strangeness of the night. Camaraderie formed in lace-trimmed dressing, rooms. Advice was passed like whispered recipes. One could learn in 10 minutes how to re-curl hair with a hot spoon, or how to get bootblack out of red satin without weeping. Downstairs, the last embers in the fireplace snapped softly in protest over having stayed awake this long. A half-empty bottle of cherry cordial stood next to the day's leftover receipts, one of which had a lipstick imprint and a doodle of what might have been a frustrated duck or a moral philosopher. interpretations varied. Even the madam, once the iron backbone of all order and schedule, had removed her corset and was now lounging in a Chinese silk robe, puffing gently on a clove cigarette. Her cat, a fiendish orange thing named Senator Bixby, sat curled on a pile of unpaid bills, his preferred throne. Eventually, silence took dominion, as it always does, wrapping the brothel in a soft twilight hush. But not everyone slept yet. Somewhere, in the corner room with the view of the dusty mountains, Polly, the French-speaking illusionist, was practicing card tricks in her lace gloves. She swore she'd get that coin-to-ear routine perfect by week's end, and she'd once tricked a preacher into thinking she could read dreams. Just before dawn, when the world trembled slightly with the scent of cold coffee and saddle oil, the brothel breathed deeply once more. Another night survived. Friendship, wit, and warm slippers remained intact, and as a few weary heads finally bowed to slumber, the velvet shadow still whispered with stories yet to come, if one's ears were quiet enough to dream toward them. If you tiptoed up the rickety staircase of a Wild West brothel in the small hours, past flickering gas lamps and faint music on a tin piano, you might be surprised to find not scandal or salacious revelry, but bookkeeping. Yes, dear dreamer. After the final footsteps staggered out and the chorus of hoots and hollers faded into the night, what really happened behind those lace-draped doors was a whirlwind of oddly domestic magic. Ledgers, lemon water, laundry, and letters to home. Midnight might have closed the stage, but behind the curtain, an entire backstage production was just beginning. Let's eavesdrop quietly, shall we? In brothels like the oft-overlooked Crystal Palace in Virginia City, or the Scarlet Feather in Dodge, the women who worked there weren't simply collapsing into beds lined with satin and secrets. No, many of them were gathering in the kitchen, still in corsets, but now with slippers, and peeling oranges or carding out their hair, trading gossip about clients with the same tone one might use for new fabric prices or misbehaving goats. A house madam, often more accountant than enchantress, would emerge around this time with her spectacles perched at an angle and a ledger under her arm the size of a goose. She'd sit at the kitchen table, still creaky from boot-scuffed dances earlier that night, and tally earnings in dusky lamplight. Each girl's, cut noted, room service charges deducted. Yes, that leftover cherry pie slice came off your bottom line. And fines for any broken perfume bottles or unsanctioned whiskey poured from the house bottle. And like clockwork, there was always one girl, perhaps Ruby or Liza or something dramatically French like Claudette, who had managed to mysteriously misplace $2.75 of earnings, which she insisted had been accidentally used to bribe the sheriff's goat. No one believed her. Everyone laughed anyway. What many forget is that these women were often business-savvy survivors, learning to budget, save, and even invest in properties of their own. In 1888, one Magdalena Maggie Travis quietly bought 3 boarding houses in Tombstone while still working evenings at the Velvet Dove. She retired within 5 years. You don't hear about Maggie's real estate empire in those shoot-'em-up dime novels now, do you? Back inside the lamplit haven, the ambience took a curious turn as the minutes drifted toward dawn. There might be a game of cards on the parlor floor, with bets made not in cash, but in chores. Loser washes the petticoats, someone would declare. Winner gets my turn stoking the stove at 5 a.m. Thrilling stakes. Vegas it was not. Some brothels kept pet birds, parrots to be precise, and yes, they swore. Abominably. Guess who taught them? One brothel in Deadwood harbored a parrot named Senator, who could convincingly mimic 3 different voices mid-argument. He once started a heated spat between 2 clients just by repeating, "I told you she liked me better." Not all fine-feathered friends are diplomats. Meanwhile, up in the rooms, the softer sounds of the night drifted through. The rustle of paper as someone wrote a letter they'd never send. "Dear Mama, I'm doing fine." And the rhythmic creak of a brush through long, pinned-up hair. Life in these late hours was rarely scandalous and never simple. Some women dreamed of train tickets to San Francisco or New Orleans. Others dreamed of owning a cafe with red checkered tablecloths and no piano player belting out sad songs after dark. A few dreamed simply of sleep. Not all stories were golden, of course. There were hard nights, sharp words, and hopeless silences. But even in those, there was community, a sisterhood forged in sequins and stubbornness, in survival and in sass. They weren't waiting to be saved. They were saving themselves. 1 cup of lukewarm tea and 1 clever college-bound child hidden behind a boarding school letter at a time. So, if you ever glance at an old sepia photo of Wild West women in corseted poses and feathered hats, know this: those aren't just costumes, those are armor. The night after midnight was their true stage, and beneath the rouge and rhinestones beat wildly practical, astonishingly clever hearts. Now the embers are low. The final page of the ledger has been turned. The lemonade pitcher is empty, and Senator, the parrot, has stopped muttering questions about someone named Gerald. Let's let the brothel fall quiet now, shall we? There's just one more moment in our story to drift toward, and it's waiting in the hush before dawn. As the gas lamps flickered low and the piano plinked its final tune for the night, the inside of a Wild West brothel took on an entirely different character. The bustle faded into murmurs. Corsets were loosened, wigs tilted sideways, and the last sips of rot-gut whiskey clung to the bottom of cloudy glasses. It was the hour after midnight when mascara ran, secrets bloomed, and boots were stacked like firewood by the front door. Now, you might imagine that once the saloon doors stopped swinging, the establishment descended into scandal and chaos. But more often, it drifted gently into something stranger, and rather more domestic. Miss Lily, for instance, matron of the Goldfinch Parlor in Tombstone, Arizona, had a strict rule. By 1 a.m., every brazier had to be off the chandelier, not just because it was unseemly, but because the last time one caught fire, a cowboy swore he saw a spirit rise from the ceiling fan and demanded an exorcism. They lost half a week's earnings to holy water and smoked sage. The occupants, ladies, madams, musicians, cooks, and a petty criminal named Jed who never left, fell into a rhythm not so different from a boarding house or a theatre troupe. By the early hours, beds weren't for business, they were for sore feet, bath basins, and tangled dreams. It turns out corset chafing was a universal experience, regardless of moral fibre. Discussions in the wee hours turned oddly philosophical. It wasn't out of place to catch 2 women, still half-painted in rouge and a touch of glitter, debating whether buffalo had souls or why saloon chairs always wobbled. One woman earnestly insisted she had a past life as a medieval falconer. You couldn't prove otherwise, and she was very good with pigeons. Midnight often ushered in a secret second dinner, something comforting and entirely undignified. Cold beans, crusty bread, and the remains of whatever hadn't walked off the windowsill were served by candlelight, as whispered gossip echoed through rooms like lullabies. Madame Claudine once fashioned what she called a French charcuterie from pickles, jerky, and one perfect biscuit. Allegedly, she charged extra for ambiance. Behind thin wooden walls and fringed curtains, the brothel transformed into a kind of confessional booth. Clients sometimes returned not for more of what you'd expect, but for someone to read their poorly written poems or to inquire whether sherbet could exist in the desert. It was an hour when hearts softened and the bravado of whiskey gave way to raw confession. "I reckon I'm not actually a gunslinger," one fellow whispered into his own collar, embarrassed. "I just work in bullet packaging." The women, many of whom were former school teachers, laundresses, or high society shunners, listened with the patience of saints and the bribery rates of experienced capitalists. A broken man could buy a shot of bourbon and a decade's worth of reassurance for the right price and a clean handkerchief. And the laughter. Oh, the laughter. It was a quiet kind, not the belly-chortling saloon type, but the kind that curled at the edges of the mouth, shared over shared absurdities. Bloomer mishaps, a goat that snuck into the spa room, and the endless saga of a ghost named Mildred, who allegedly knitted in the cupboards. When dawn painted the sky in soft pinks, the transformation began again. Hairpins were found in teacups. Stockings were pulled from potted plants. The place roused like an old symphony starting its overture. Softly at first, unsure of its own tempo. Ladies steeped chicory coffee over coal embers while still in slippers, preparing for another day in a town that never quite decided whether it was civilization or fantasy. The sheriff would shuffle by, nod at the porch as if in greeting to no one in particular, and keep walking. And in those last drowsy moments, while the streets began to clatter with hooves and the sun crept slowly toward the roofs, the brothel remained, for just a little longer, a realm between the waking world and dreams, a place where names were changed, stories were embroidered like lace, and nothing, not even sin or sorrow, could outweigh the comforts of warm soup and the luxury of a kind listener. So now, as the lamps dim and the tobacco smoke settles quietly into woodwork carved by now forgotten hands, you can rest easy, dear dreamer. The night has had her secrets, and so have the people within it. Funny, flawed, and tucked beneath embroidered covers, they remind us that history whispers loudest not in gunshots or gold, but in every mumbled bedtime joke and half-remembered lullaby. Close your eyes now. The cowboys are asleep, the piano snoozes, and even Jed, stop muttering about possum conspiracies. We've stayed up late enough.